It took a long time. I have some audio from Dave Beerscheid, who says that as chamber president at that time, he wanted a restaurant, and Fern's Cafe was the only one that was there. And many of the chain restaurants wouldn't have anything to do with Moab because they thought it was never going to go tourism-wise, and that the population was too small. It wasn't long before that wasn't a problem anymore, but the tone of the time in the downturn of uranium, it still felt a lot like a mining town, you know, even though there was some transition, there was a lot of retooling the identity of the place, is one of the things that showed up. So defining the timeline identified some bright points. I'll share some of those, and then if you want to break in with some comments, that'd be fine. According to our source materials that were gathered from digital newspapers, thank you Times Independent, and Utah's many historical archives at state universities, and from people who were there, we placed the bust, the beginning of the bust, in 1979. Though the market for uranium began to slide early in the 60s, and the vision of a tourist economy was already in the minds of many a desert dreamer. In 1979, the 3 Mile Island incident ground the growth of the nuclear energy to a halt. The accident crystallized anti-nuclear safety concerns and resulted in new regulations for the nuclear industry. It's been cited as a contributor to the decline of a new reactor construction program and a slowdown that, again, was already underway in the 70s. Partially because of global markets, because of a glut. We also have audio of Atomic Energy Commissioner and former county and city council person Bill McDougald talking about exactly what the feds did in terms of their support of the uranium economy and the mining to help really make it a powerhouse economically. Also some audio of people talking about just exactly how it felt as a mining town. It really was sort of a one economy place. Everybody worked in some way related to the mines. In any case, when the 3 Mile Island event happened, there was a lot of attention that was being paid on every level. There was a lot of awareness at that time about the risks. That partial meltdown resulted in the release of radioactive gases and radioactive iodine into the environment. Here, I think what I want to do is share a couple of photos of Moab in that end of the bust thing. It was Boomtown, Moab, USA. Let's see if I can do this for us here. I'll share the screen and go to Moab, Utah, Boomtown, USA. And I don't know if you can see it. That was...
We can see it, Christy.
Awesome. And this is the Atlas Mill, probably around the time that they first started getting word that no more uranium was going to be needed for the arsenal. It's now about 1978, 1979. It was the uranium center of America. You can see that the population was 2,715, and it certainly did increase when the boom was happening. The jobs were not easy. We have a leach operator, last name Somerville, operating what's called the doghouse. This is Claude Tidwell in the yellow cake packaging area. So these are 50-gallon drums of yellow cake uranium, high grade. And speaking of high grade, this was the kind of thing where uranium was king. You know, we had parades, the uranium days. And this is, of course, a float of actual yellow cake. This is a thing called an acid bleach agitator. And you can see the kind of safety regs that were available at the time. We also have some very cool audio of all kinds of people who were miners that talked about the kind of attitude towards risk management at that time. In the 50s and 60s, let's just say not so much. A kind of a very dangerous and rough job. They did their best with ventilation, but not necessarily with keeping people from being exposed to the things that they were working with. As time came on, of course, they learned many things about how to do better. But right about the time they got it all down, it started to fall apart. Now I'll come back and see if I can pull this off too. So am I back? Am I good? Am I showing? Help me, Mary.
You're still screen sharing.
Am I? Let me get big then. I apologize.
Great photos.
I will continue with them as I find where I am here. It was layoffs that happened. We had easily 1 in 5 people that were unemployed. We had houses and the prices that plummeted like you couldn't believe. We also have clips of people who were in real estate who said that they had 250 empty houses in their own real estate arsenal, and they were making money by taking care of those properties at like $50 a month and turning a tidy profit. But persons who had graduated from high school and were making up to $40 an hour without any higher education found themselves suddenly without anything to replace it. Homes, bankruptcies, shuttered businesses. It was a really difficult transition in that time. The stats on the unemployment are grim. And during the middle to, the early to middle 80s, the layoffs were just staggering. I'll see if I can find some headlines from the Times as I put myself back into order here. The many miners that were there, okay, so they moved to Nevada, a lot of them, to try their luck with gold, because there was a little bit of a effort with gold happening in Nevada, not far from Vegas. The ones who stayed, they looked for a different kind of gold, I suppose, a naturally recurring resource. So we're only just like the beginning. We're just in the 80s where it just kind of fell more or less overnight. We have lots of wonderful stories about how slow it was and how it felt. December of 1980, the 96th congressional session passed a legislation establishing a 5-year nuclear safety research and demonstration and development program. But the locals and everybody in the lurch were like, what now? What now? And there are so many side histories and contexts that this frame of time period represents. With 87% of Grand County's land being public, state, or federal land, the questions about how to best share and use the lands had a really particular flavor with the uprising known as the Sagebrush Rebellion. Maybe you've heard of it. I also am excited to share one soon day. Ray Tibbetts, a rancher and merchant, also former county commissioner, sharing a word about that time, the values and visions that led him to take a D9 cat to the then wilderness study area and local gem of a canyon, now known as Grandstaff. canyon. The clip and the oral history itself was gained with the gracious permission of Resford Rouser and the Tibbetts family. Resford completed his project for the University of Utah's Environmental Humanities program, and we're thrilled to be able to share it soon. In fact, Ed Abbey weighed in. We have audio from Ed too, who was in on the rebellion, but from a different take, on wild places and access, where he was talking about the need to defend land and being able to get out in it by any means necessary. So it was a contentious time. Getting out on the land, the ways that locals and visitors accessed it took a turn in 1983 that not everybody loved. The wheels of change rolled, if slowly at first, when in 1983, Moab's first bike shop, Rim Tours, owned by brothers Bill and Robin Groff, opened. So that's in 1983. Bill shares about how there wasn't a whole lot of high aspirations, or people didn't view it like it was going to go far. Not at all. And it took a while until the wheels started to really generate, bringing in the kinds of people that wanted to be here, that people began to see, oh, it's a thing. And so they did. I'm going to pause here and find a few more photographs. And Kira, maybe you can vogue for a second while I do that. And that takes us up to early mid 80s.
Yeah. So in 1983, when that shop opened, mountain biking was a gleam in the eye of outdoor enthusiasts. There wasn't such a thing as a mountain bike yet. Basically, they had road bikes that they would take on slick rock trails, and that was the cover of a magazine. Was it Mountain Bike Magazine? I'll have to double check the name of the magazine here. Let me see. It was a feature article for the first mountain biking magazine that ever existed. And the photos from that article were of road bikers on slick rock trails being led by Rim Tours, which was the Groff's endeavor. So that kind of helped put. Let's see if you go to full screen, Christy. That'll make that. Yeah, there you go. Two very suave looking dudes. So they were both workers in the mining industry who had been laid off as the mining operations declined, and they had a lot of time on their hands and they loved to mountain bike. So one of the ways that they came up with to take up their time and give themselves a way to stay here was to open up a bike shop.
We're just going through a few photographs. Thank you so much, Kira. So here we have just all these headlines about how the unemployment jumped again, and people were viewing their history with this sort of rise and fall of how are we going to proceed. Things were a little bit down at heel. This photograph is, let me see if I can get me out of there. The old Cisco diner. The old Cisco diner, where a reliably salty waitress might ask you what you wanted. There were many efforts, bright ideas that started to happen at around that time when people were asking, what now? And how now? Let me see if I can go back again. And
there we go. So the mill closed down in 1984. Christy, you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah. Let me, so people were saying, mountain biking is going to be a waste of time. I've got a great one of Jimmy Walker, who's got this great, broad, warm laugh. And his audio says, well, you know, I thought I was smarter than everybody else. And I thought that mountain biking was going to be a waste of time. And then he just cracks up. We're trying to envision, you know, what next? And yeah, indeed, 1984, Atlas shuts down, ending the industry's period as Moab's major economic force. After the mill was closed in 1984, the pond was capped, and there was also a pile of mine tailings that was over 90 feet tall. Pollutants from the waste tailings were leaching into the river, inferred from the lethal effect of concentrations of ammonia on the fish in the river. And then remediation efforts started and continue, of course, today. But the questions about Moab's future weren't settled. They were really just heating up. In 1985, a proposed nuclear waste repository and the resulting fight for the future of an economically distressed Moab forced the community to assert its identity, whether as a visitation mecca or whatever they would decide. But it became clear that the choices were not as a industrial waste zone, as proposed by this strategy to bring more mineral extraction and industry and heavy industry into Moab because of the mineral lease monies and the engine of familiar industry. Well, this iteration of identity, the struggle to answer the question, what now, strengthened when efforts to create a highway from Vernal to Moab were prevented by the voters, who also voted to change the form of government to more accurately represent this changing Moab. Betty Stanton, who was, she's still just such an icon for culture in Moab, and gathered some oral histories and for the museum at a time, and really helped with film development in the area. She was the executive director of a thing called Central Services at the time. And she said that beginning in 1985, efforts towards increased tourism and the focus of Moab as a retirement center were identified as priorities. But there were lots of people who were there who remember this choice was not an instant hit. And I have some great, remembrances about how it was pretty controversial, this becoming of a new place with new people and a new economy. By 1986, there were a sea of for sale signs, and many businesses were boarded up, and 2/3 of the workforce collected unemployment. In a census tally by 86, Moab won the dubious honor of leading the list in population decline with a drop of 17%. So people were leaving in droves, and there were people that were coming in at that time. There were Europeans that had discovered Moab by that time. And the trickling roll of people that were coming to do more than just hike were beginning to come in, even though you could still buy the house on 4th East and 3rd South for $10,000. But by 1987, there's this little, so I would say that the bottom of the bust was in 1983. That's what the numbers show. 1983, everything was just the worst. By 1987, though, record numbers of visitors began to be tallied in Arches. I've got these articles that show these super excited headlines about 1,000 people in Arches. It's grown a lot since then. Moab, again, really then and now, showed who it was in this tough time by instead of answering what now, I'm thinking they answered how now. They knew how to create, how to sort of paint the barn and put on a show, how to make do by the way of potluck, bake sale, costume party, by not throwing anything of use away, by being thrifty, cagey with their stuff. especially not that old truck on the blocks in the yard, and by putting forth good old grit. I do have some stories around the world's most scenic dump. This is an exciting side quest that Kira Withrow wrote an article about in the current Moab happenings. We also have Joe Kingsley telling the story about how that all came about, where in a big kind of brain session about what do we want to do as a community, somebody said, you guys have it made, even your dump is beautiful. And they thought this was so funny that they said, hey, yeah, let's put it out there. Let's have a contest. Whose dump is more beautiful? And many efforts like this were put forward to put Moab on the map. And example, it's really rather unique character. A variety of wide economic incubation projects were happening. Moab considered state block grant funds to allay the financial distresses. 88 was actually a really big year. I'm going to hand it back to you, Kira, and then look for some of these headline photographs and more photographs about what it was like in the mid to late 80s.
Mm-hmm. So thanks, Christy. The time in the mid 80s to late 80s was when I think that the reality of the situations caught up with a lot of the locals here, and they really realized that they were in a very precarious situation. The downturn hit everyone very hard, and the people who couldn't move away or didn't want to move away had to figure out new ways to come together as a community. And one of the ways that they found to move forward was to share their love of the place with other people and start bringing people here to admire the space and to kind of, create an experience for people. In the 80s, in the late 80s, these new businesses started cropping up. A lot of them had to do with tourism and bringing people from outside in to create experiences for them. That new course for the future there, City, County, and Chamber called town meeting to chart a new course for the future. Christy, is this the meeting where
This is pretty much the meeting. It was a big effort to like double down on this effort to give residents an opportunity to develop a blueprint for future aspirations. And it was to be the first stage in preparing the community's description of itself. All the discussions included sort of economic issues that we were facing, and also industrial development, planning and zoning, retirement, tailings cleanup. And a task force set itself to compile all of those impressions and desires and antipathies in the living room meetings throughout the area. Super contentious, classic Moab style. The meetings were yielding a vision that eventually emphasized tourism, but not without worry. A lot of locals feared creating a monster, you see. They feared they might be creating a monster beyond their control, one that might be leading Moab in a direction they did not want to go. The costs, the loss of rural character, familiar things, quietude. So it was not easy.
And I remember from some of the oral histories that we've collected that the opposition to tourism, or rather the alternatives that were named instead of tourism, included a return to mining. A lot of people wanted to find a way to somehow bring mining back to Moab, not necessarily with uranium, but possibly with the other mineral deposits that are in Moab. And another alternative was agriculture, that Moab had been an agricultural community before it had been a mining community, and there was a push to return to that. So there were alternatives that were named, that were also potentially feasible. Other people, of course, suggested, let's diversify the economy. Let's bring in, totally other industries that have never been in Moab.
A lot of people talked about light industry at that time, and it's still kind of the gold standard. Everybody wants light industry. But people who were used to heavy industry had no problem. And they didn't have any problem dedicating Cisco as an industrial zone. And those efforts continued, even though the economy as a powerhouse wasn't happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it almost seems to me that the push towards tourism came about almost as it seemed the easiest course forward. It was the swiftest course to revitalize the town by bringing in new money from outside. Because if you think about an economy that is diminished, there's not enough spending power within that community to really spur new growth. So you need the money to come from somewhere else. And that's, what tourism does is actually import people to spend money in the community. Sorry, I'm getting a little sidetracked.
Oh, it's okay. There were an awful lot of conversations, though, at the time about what was going to be lighter on the land, what was it going to cost, how would we maintain ourselves? And I'll just say that we have worked really hard for the troubles that we have today. There were so many meetings and so many efforts. The phrase "a diversified economy" predates cars in the history of Moab people trying to build what Moab could become. It's still one of those elusive, wonderful ideas that we're so framed by. With 87% public land, how do we share? What is multiple use like? Lots of questions continue to animate these conversations that really just sort of kicked into gear. Questions, limits to growth and that kind of thing. Here I also have a way cool seconds or so from Bill Hedden, who was county commissioner at that time and one of the forces or players involved in bringing the community together to try and iterate its new identity. He said that he would talk to community leaders from around the region, maybe not even in the state, not in rural areas, that would say to him at various political conventions, we would never want to be another Moab, because they were afraid of the very arc that we had hopped on, to grow in this way and become a tourism place, inferring that it would lose its soul if it did. We would never become another Moab. And Bill would reply, he said, I always ask them, and I'm quoting and paraphrasing him here, thank you, Bill Hedden, is there any activity that you would be willing to forswear in order to not become another Moab? He would ask. And or is it just because you don't have two national parks and mountains and a river and climbing and mountain biking and jeeping? But they never had any answer, was the sum of his thing. And so Moab had some pretty unique things to share with the world. It was not an easy decision, but just as we were trying to iterate, a signal event occurred on this timeline that led some to believe that indeed an end of an era had come. The local bar burned to the ground. Now, it wasn't just any bar, the Poplar Place. Fire gutted it in 1989. This was a central watering hole, and it was a bar and pizza parlor. There was also a prime gathering spot for locals who liked to dress up, I might say, in every era that I've been able to see. They loved to have a good time. But early on the morning of Wednesday, January 25th, Fire Chief Troy Black said the building was totally involved, and the flames were shooting from the roof when the fire was reported. It's one of the oldest buildings in town, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places. Over the years, the Adobe building served as a post office, a liquor store, a hardware store, and again as a grocery store before standing vacant and sad for a bit, and being restored to its present use as a eating house restaurant known as the LaSalle House.
Mm-hmm.
Houses rising from the ashes of downturn was a key moment as things began to turn around. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Kara, because we've got some headlines about how growth really started to happen. It's like we had a glimpse of the future then. Things started to turn up. We could see the future, and it was wearing Lycra and wrap around mirror sunglasses and ready to flip a house. I'll find some pictures now.
Yeah, let's see them. This period of time, this transition saw a lot of building projects and really revitalizing the infrastructure of the town, as well as bringing in a lot of new people. I'm not actually sure what the population increase was in the early 90s. It's hard to find out these things.
I may have something. I'll find it.
Okay. So the cost of buildings started to go up, the cost of homes. The interest in Moab was starting to take off, and it looked like just as Christy said, that we were seeing a way forward that was going to be successful, and that we were out of the woods, or we were moving out of the woods. We hadn't gotten out of the woods yet, but there was a path. And Christy, I'm not seeing those photos. Did you find them yet?
I'm looking for a particular one.
Just checking.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as we're moving forward, I see that it's 7:15, and I'm trying to move a little quicker now. We have so much material to discuss, but let's see. We'll move forward here.
Here's one I can share. It's one about what was happening by 92. 91 is when Jeff Whitney, Grant County building inspector, said that it was the end of the bust because of the amount of housing and building that was starting to occur. What we're looking at here is that Moab was building in the millions by 92. There was just so much going on. There were major oil and gas discoveries near Moab in 92. The discussions about the advisory board over the major highway over the Book Cliffs corridor was like a road that came back again. Moab continued to revisit and reiterate and reassert its vision about things like the road, the Book Cliffs Highway, here in Moab, Utah.
Yeah, Christy, if you could go forward to the first picture that you showed, there was a secondary headline that I thought was fascinating. One more, I think it was the very first headline this one. So yes, the building is in the millions, but look down at the bottom there, 27 candidates sought to sit on the city council seats. So yeah. 4 years before, maybe 6 years before, there were only 5 people on the was it 5 on the council? I remember reading this. There were too few people on the council, and they couldn't fill all the seats because there were that few people left in town.
This is one of those stories that really kind of deserves its own story. A lot like the cleanup of the Atlas Mill site deserves its own story, or maybe the world's most scenic dump deserves its own story. But how the community gathered at that time to reshape the government around that. It was a big deal. It went from 3 people, and the fight was big to keep it 3. It's too long a story to go into here, except that the people that were elected at that time really also kind of made a stamp on the flavor of how I think politics has proceeded ever since in Moab, Utah. It had a little bit more monochromatic political feel to it on the county when it was a commission. Now much broader. As we know, there is now a effort to, in fact, the law's already been passed, right, to bring it back to a smaller form of government. I think we were grandfathered in because Grand County was just oddball enough, like uranium itself, you know, to want it its own way, and was one of the outliers about how counties govern themselves. So lots of changes going on about that. Who gets to call the shots? It's a big question then and now.
I'll just jump in, Christy and Kira, with a little time check and remind everybody that we're down to the last 10 minutes of this evening together, and invite anybody who's watching on Facebook Live or here in Zoom to send us a question in the chat. I'm watching those and would be happy to relay those. And had one, which is when you said 1 in 5 people were unemployed in bust times, we've been approximately at that statistic in Grand County these days in this tumultuous moment, and was wondering what sort of parallels you two see from then to now and why all of this matters today in 2020.
Do you want to take it, Christy?
That's a delicious question. I'll respond and then toss it over to you. It's like playing ball. In some ways, it's self-evident why we would be interested in revisiting how Moab scratched it out from a big economic downturn that was unforeseen and out of their control. How do we create, right out of what we have, a new way? During the bust, I will say this, people didn't have cash, but in my eyes, they were rich in ways the bust made really clear, already isolated geographically, already well-versed in the truth of rural interdependency, like that cup of sugar that the neighbor gives. The necessity of hard times made for a deeply fertile creative imagination to answer the question of what now? This resourcefulness, this grit, this rough around the edges, play hard, work hard, salty character of Moab really came forward then to make do, and sometimes using the charming rusty bits of its old self, waiting to be made into something new, something that would go the distance. And I guess I just want to say, so moved by noticing that those characteristics didn't go anywhere. Mm-hmm. And I celebrate the fact that they exist, and I'm depending on them so that we can maybe apply some of those lessons now.
I've got another question from a viewer on Zoom. This last one we were looking forward to right now, and this one is, what was Moab's economy before the uranium boom? So
before the boom?
Before the uranium boom.
It was ag.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agriculture. Yes. There was some mining still. There was mining for coal and copper. It was steady, but it was small. The population was around, I think, 1,500 or maybe a little higher than that. It was a small town. The mining boom saw an increase of 5 times the population increased. So, the population was around 1,200 or 1,500, and it jumped to close to 6,000 in the span of 8 years. So what it was like before then, mellow. Let's say that. It was a slow, small town.
Super mellow. And a lot of the oral histories from that time reveal, it was a rural town, so everybody knew each other and depended on each other much more in the way that I was referring to earlier. We were famous for fruit. The peaches that we now think of as Palisade peaches, we have records of people saying that our peaches were as big as cantaloupes. And there were these giant old trees that lined Main Street for ever so long. And so it was a shady, quiet oasis where people grew things. And the only hard part was distribution then and now, because you couldn't pack a cantaloupe-sized peach very far and expect it to do much. So they grew slowly.
Yeah, I did want to comment just very quickly on that first question about how the unemployment time, 1 in 5 people being unemployed back then, and how this parallels with our situation now. Mm-hmm. One of the ways in which the community really came together and supported each other during that period was through this potluck tradition that where they would buy, Christy, you could tell more about this, but they would buy a whole bunch of Spanish rice and stretch it. Everybody would bring a whole bunch of food from their garden. They were planting, a lot of people were planting their own gardens in much larger capacity than they had been during the mining boom, to have that extra food and to be more self-sufficient. I think we're seeing a lot of that today as well. Not so much with the potluck thing, but I do see people every day on Facebook groups trading eggs for vegetables, or saying, I have a whole bunch of tomatoes, who's hungry, and inviting people to come and share food. I think that's one of the ways that I see that is a huge parallel of what we did then and what we're doing now, is just coming together as a community and supporting one another and sharing what we have.
I just will add the smallest thing and say that in 1992, when we've marked that as kind of like the bracket of the end of the bust and the beginning really of an identifiable boom, there was quite an awful lot of this care that showed up in the blooming of, I don't know how many, several cultural organizations and nonprofits were born that year. KZMU Moab Community Radio was born that year. The Moab Music Festival was born that year. The Moab Arts Festival was born that year. The Classic Car Show was born that year.
Lots of creativity.
Lots of creativity. And so this really paint the barn, put on the show quality of, we can figure this out. We'll just use what we have, I think is applicable then, now, future. Yeah, we take care of the self in a way that I don't know a lot of other places do. Moab's perhaps a little unique in this way. I hope so. I think do I want to end with something rusty? I might.
Some desert varnish. Do we have any more questions, Mary?
I don't see any other questions at this time.
Anyone else want to jump in with some questions?
Comments?
This will be available on our Facebook page for folks who are interested in revisiting this conversation or sharing it in any way.
Well,
yeah.
We can read your screen still.
Can you? Well, then let me just go this way and let me. Script is, you can see this rusty stuff. Thank you, everyone, for attending this virtual event. Thank you so much. We've got some rusty things to admire here. I just want to come back and just thank everybody for sharing their expertise. A big thank you to everyone for this virtual event. And as a reminder, a great way to support the museum, especially as we face continued closure due to the pandemic, is to join as a member. Members of the museum enjoy a variety of special benefits and are integral in supporting our mission to educate and inspire folks about the cultural and natural history of southeastern Utah. More information about the membership can be found at our website, as pictures and audio too can give you quite a little bit. It's a great website. The next Tuesdays with Museum event is called Canyon Country on Strike: Coal Miners, Labor Unions, and Women's Labor, a Revolution in Southeastern Utah, with Christian Wright, the author of Carbon County, USA, Miners for Democracy in Utah and the West, about the history and legacy of labor in Utah. Join Wright and all of us here at the museum staff for an exciting look at these intertwined stories. It's going to be on Tuesday, September the 15th at 6:30 p.m. We hope you will join us then. Thank you. Thank you, Kara. Thank you, Moab.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Very, very briefly, hold on, Christy. I wanted to suggest one other way to support the museum is to share stories.
No,
so while we have done this research, Christy and I have uncovered the fact that a lot of people have stories that they don't think are historical. They don't think they're qualified to share them. This is the furthest thing from the truth. Everyone's stories matters. So if you have a story about this time period or another time period that you think history would benefit from having as a cultural resource for this town, please contact the museum and we will find a way for you to share that story on your terms.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kara. Get a hold of Forrest Rogers and also Tara Barish if you have things or photos. At 70s, 80s time, we still don't have as much as we want.
Yep, this is true. But thank you all for joining us. And
thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for putting this together. Bye-bye, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.